This morning as we talk about aging, philanthropy, and estate planning. Our presenter today is Robert B. Fleming. He's a certified elder law attorney and a partner in the Tucson firm of Fleming and Curdy, with a practice focused on trust and special needs trust administration, guardianship, conservatorship, estate planning, and probate. Mr. Fleming is the co-author of the Elder Law Answer book and of New Times, New Challenges, Law and Advice for Savvy Seniors and Their Families. Mr. Fleming has been selected as the fellow of both the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel and the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. He is the past chair of both the Mental Health and Elder Law and the Probate and Trust sections of the State Bar of Arizona, and has been the president of the National Elder Law Foundation. Perhaps most importantly, though, he is a father, a husband, a grandfather, a scuba diver, a pilot, and a martial arts practitioner. So he brings a bevy of skills to us this morning. Perhaps we'll get some scuba diving questions in later. Robert, I'll hand it off to you to take it away.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I keep thinking I probably ought to rewrite that stock introduction to get all the smarmy stuff out of it, but it's kind of nice to hear smarmy once in a while too. I am an attorney here in Tucson, and as Tamara said, my practice is really devoted to estate planning, trust administration, and especially special needs trust administration. And we also do a fair amount of working with charities and philanthropists generally. So what I plan on doing today is talking through some of the elements of estate planning, the use of philanthropy, but I want to have a real emphasis on the characteristics of aging and dealing with an aging population. I think most of you who are in attendance right now are people who are professionals in the field in one way or another in some aspect of the estate planning and philanthropy community. And some of this information will be familiar to you as well. But I want to try to tie it together in a way that is helpful, particularly for clients, so you can share some of this information. You can apply it to your own lives. And one of the things that I am struck by when I do public presentations about issues of aging is how often the questions begin with "my mother," because a lot of the issues that we deal with here at Fleming and Curdy are very intimately important to the people we talk to, even when we're talking to other professionals. So I'm really going to start by talking about aging, and this is like big surprise. America is aging. You've heard the statistics, you've seen some of the charts and graphs, but here's one that I think is particularly relevant to illustrate the way in which America is aging. This is a graph of the absolute number of people in each age group by decade. So actually it's by half decade. It's going forward by 5-year increments. And you can see what's happening over time from when the graph started in 1900 to when it ends, projecting down through, I think it's 2060. One of the kind of interesting things, I'm a baby boomer, and one of the kind of interesting things to me is to see the baby boom show up as the graph progresses, just as we got about 10 years before the baby boom shows up, and here we come. We are the proverbial pig in the python, and you can see us moving through the younger ages, and here we are now at about today, and it's very interesting to see, to me, to see the way that curve flattens out. It does two things. It flattens out dramatically from 1900 to 2060, and it also, the tail end extends out. And so that really illustrates for you the way in which America is aging. And by the way, a graph for other countries would look similar, but the baby boom phenomenon is more powerful in the US than it was in a lot of other countries. But the same kind of thing is happening with different chart sizes and different end years and other circumstances. Notice how much the percentage of the population is extending out now into the over 90 by the end of the graph, and how much it flattens so that there are quite a lot of quite a bit older Americans than there were just 100 years ago, dramatically more than there were 100 years ago. Another way of looking at the same data is to compare the proportion in each age group, again, from 1960 through 2060. So 1960, we already have the baby boomers in there. You can see them at the bottom of this pyramid. But by 2060, what we have is columns. On the left are the males, and on the right are the females in each of these graphs. So what you're seeing is how much more, how many more women there will be at the oldest ages by 2060. Quite a shelf at the top, but there will be a much older population, and it will be heavily female, and it will be supported by a much smaller proportion of younger people. Now, that of course is not absolute population numbers. There will be more people than there were in 100 years before, but the age distribution will be very much a cylindrical shape. And that means a lot of things about the population. It means that there'll be fewer young people supporting, and I don't just mean financially, I mean emotionally and in terms of additional effort that it takes to take care of somebody who's aging. And it also means dramatically that the incidence of dementia is going to be a critical consideration as we age. And that's a critical consideration for us as a society, for you if you are professionals in the field, for you as professionals, and for the individuals who are riding this sled into an aging future. That gets us an opportunity to talk about one of the characteristics of aging that is critically important to consider, and that is the onset and development of dementia. So what I want to do for a minute is talk a little bit about what dementia looks like, what the different kinds of dementia are, how they might differently affect people, and then a little bit about what we're doing about dementia as the population ages. So everybody is familiar with the kind of ordinary senior moment problem of memory, the periodic loss of a word or the name of a person you have known for 30 or 40 or 60 years, whose name you just can't conjure up. And that's not dementia, is the good news on this subject. That is just the ordinary aging process and the inability to call up a quick reference to a word. That doesn't indicate that you're about to become demented. So good news about that. Those senior moments are not scary for you individually, or they shouldn't be. They're annoying as all get out, but they shouldn't scare you about your future. The real dementias fall into a bunch of different categories. The 500-pound gorilla of dementia, of course, is Alzheimer's dementia. The estimates, it's surprising to me how hard it is to find a definitive answer, but the Alzheimer's Association and other papers that I've read indicate that the incidence of Alzheimer's among those who are demented, so of patients who have dementia diagnosed, 60 to 80% of them are Alzheimer's type dementias. So by far the most common dementia. Not too far behind that, however, is the vascular dementia category. Vascular dementia used to be called multi-infarct dementia, so you may be familiar with that term. Not that it has become politically improper, incorrect, or unacceptable, but vascular dementia is a little bit better description. As between these two, which make up a very large portion of the dementias, the process of the dementia in both cases is inexorable and negative. There are no cures, there are no really effective treatments. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the treatments that are being used, but the graph of decline, of cognitive decline over time, is inexorably downward. So if you were to graph Alzheimer's type dementia on an x-axis of cognitive capacity and a y-axis of time, Alzheimer's type dementia typically will be a gradual curve. It may be a more rapid curve, it may be a more extended curve, but it will look like a curve if you could graph the absolute cognitive effect. Whereas the vascular dementia typically looks like stair steps. So you'll be a long period perhaps of no diminution of capacity and then a sudden drop. And that's because vascular dementia is related to those little mini strokes. So there will be an event that has a significant effect. One of the things that is really difficult for people to deal with is that if there is some percentage, whatever that percentage is, likelihood that you will have vascular dementia and you get Alzheimer's dementia, you still have the same percentage likelihood that you'll have vascular dementia too. So there are a lot of people who have multiple dementing conditions, and none of these conditions is protective against a diagnosis in the other case as well. So that could mean you could have 3 different kinds of dementias and have a very confused treatment mode. So, but what difference does it make? I've told you that the curve in virtually all of these is downward, whether it's by stair steps or a gradual curve. So who cares what diagnosis you have if there's no really effective treatment in any case? Well, it does actually make a difference. If what you have is vascular dementia, well, we can't turn that curve around. We might be able to prevent or at least slow the onset of additional stair steps by treating the underlying vascular condition. If you have Alzheimer's type dementia, we know that it's likely to result in a memory loss, but it's really primarily a memory-related function, whereas vascular dementia and Lewy body disease and some of the other dementing conditions have a tendency to affect not just memory, and in some cases, almost no effect or little effect on memory, but big effects on judgment and executive function. And so if you know what which dementing condition your family member suffers from, you have some picture of the future and what kinds of things you ought to look out for. And you might have some indication about the kinds of treatment that might help delay the worsening of the condition. In addition to the 2 big dementing conditions, Alzheimer's type dementia and vascular dementia, there are Lewy body disease and frontotemporal dementia and a whole bunch of conditions that have dementing side effects like Parkinson's and AIDS and others. And none of those kinds of conditions are treatable in the sense of reversing dementia. In the law, we often talk about people having lucid moments, somebody who is demented, who is briefly able to come back and have an intelligent conversation and make decisions. Well, in medicine, lucid moments are a little bit of a fiction. While somebody may be variable in any of these dementing conditions, they may have better mornings than they do evenings. Some few may have better evenings than they have mornings. They may do better at home than they do in a professional office. They may do better in a professional office than at home. But the progress of these diseases is inexorably downward, and that's the bad news. The other conditions that might present as dementing that actually might be treatable, there are a very small proportion of demented patients. But there are a couple of them. There are some diet disorders, particularly vitamin B loss, and one big one that often gets diagnosed as dementia, but isn't really a dementing condition at all among the elderly, is depression. Depression will often appear like it's dementia, and people who are depressed might get a demented diagnosis, when in fact they could be treated for depression and they might respond very well to the treatment. So that's kind of the bad news. Dementia is a thing that happens. We all know that it is more common among the elderly. We know that the most common kind of dementia is Alzheimer's. We know that very few of the dementing conditions can be treated in any way to reverse the dementia, at least under current available modalities. But here's a question for you. What percentage of 75-year-olds do you think actually display dementia? And what I'm asking you now is not how many people 75 and older are demented, but of people who turn 75 in this year, what percentage of them will now have a diagnosis, an identifiable dementia? So think about that for a minute. Peg that number in your head, kind of guess what you think it might be. And then I hope be surprised by the actual number. It's something on the order of about 5%. Dementia among 75-year-olds as picking an age. You know, the very first time I ever had this conversation, I picked 65 because that seemed like an old age. And now I'm almost 70, and so I'm using 75 as the threshold. So in 5 years, there'll be about a 5% chance statistically that I might have a dementia. By the way, one of the ways to help prevent dementia is to keep giving Zoom webinars and keep working actively. That tends to delay at least the onset of symptomology, if not the actual underlying condition. But that aside, it's only about 5%. Now, the bad news in this score is that the dementia frequency about doubles in something less than every decade after that. So it climbs pretty rapidly. But even according to the chart that you see here, and this, by the way, is a British journal reporting British numbers, I have a hard time finding as good a chart for an American set of studies, but the numbers are very similar when you look at their charts, I should say. I have a hard time finding a graph. The charts, though, indicate a pretty similar kind of spread. Even by the time you get to 90 plus, you're still only at 30 or 35% dementia on this chart. My 95-year-old mother has begun to show some signs of dementia, but only in the last couple of years has there been any really noticeable diminution. And mostly it's just kind of the ordinary slowing of mental processes. It takes her a little longer to come up with words. Though I will tell you that she has an astonishing ability to remember the day anybody she ever met died. And almost everybody she ever met has died. So that's a huge database of dates that she is still able to conjure up in her mid-90s. There's some more good news about dementia, and this is important to recognize. One of the things that is interesting that is going on and has been noticed in the last couple of decades is that there is a shrinking frequency of dementia. That seems to be tied to our better health. We are living longer, but we are more healthy than our grandparents were at similar ages or at the end of life. And that's especially true of cardiovascular health. We are much more attuned to keeping good cardiovascular health practices in our lives, and are generally better living. That is to say, better diet, better mental involvement, and we're doing more things that help delay at least the onset of dementia. There's a study out of Denmark that suggests that that might be a 2% diminution of dementia frequency in each year, and each year since the mid-90s. And there's another study, the Knopman study that I've cited here on this slide, that says that something like 15% reduction in the frequency of dementia per decade for people born after 1929. My mother, unfortunately, was born in 1924, so I guess she doesn't get the benefit of that study. But significant diminution of the frequency of dementia. Now, it's important to note that those studies both make it clear that that's mostly cardiovascular disease reduction that generates a lowering of the vascular dementia part of it, and that is not really affecting Alzheimer's type dementia in the same way. But you all know that there's possible treatments for dementia. Sort of peculiarly, as I was preparing to do this presentation, checking my newspaper last night, I see that there's a brand new drug that is going to treat Alzheimer's type dementia. And so that's very hopeful. There are some treatments on the horizon. So that looks like maybe good news. However, a little grain of salt here, none of the current treatments for Alzheimer's type disease address the underlying disease and reverse it. All they do, all that any of the treatments, including the brand new one that's being talked about now, all that they do is take a curve that looks like this and extend it for a little further distance before the downward spiral begins. So if you get very early in the diagnosis, if you get Aricept or this new drug, which I think is going to be pronounced aducanumab. Boy, there's a mouthful. All they're going to do is maybe delay the early diminution, and when somebody begins to be noticeably demented, it's already too late for them to have any benefit from those current drugs. But there are some other studies in the pipeline that might suggest that there might be some treatment. Nothing really that looks like it's going to be reversing, it's going to reverse any of the dementias, but at least some additional opportunities to slow the onset of dementia. The other thing that is good news is something I alluded to before. Remember that depression, vitamin B deficiency, diet-related dementias, though they're infrequent, they are eminently treatable. So if you have a good differential diagnosis, sometimes you can reduce the problem of dementia. Remember again that people have multiple conditions. So somebody who has Alzheimer's type dementia and has no available treatment may also be depressed, and that exacerbates the appearance of the dementia. You treat the depression, it might reduce the effect of the dementia, though it's not curing the Alzheimer's, it's not reversing the dementia that is caused by the Alzheimer's. The quality of their life improves, and their ability to deal with day-to-day things improves as well. Despite the way I talk about this subject, I don't actually have a medical degree or any medical training. I'm passionate about this, and one of the things that frustrates me personally and professionally, I guess, is that I don't think the medical community is as quick to explain this area of medicine to patients and family members and the professionals that they work with as they ought to be. You should be hearing all of this discussion from an actual trained medical person. What I know, however, is the effect of all of that medical information on the law. And this is exactly the topic that I wanted to focus on today, is what it means to be able to do your estate planning and make decisions about your future at a time when you are aging and maybe suffering from debilitating conditions of aging. And dementia is the big one, but it's not the only one. We can also talk about reduced hearing and reduced vision and all sorts of other conditions that might affect somebody's ability to make decisions about themselves and their future. In the law, we used to talk about competence. We used to say that somebody was competent until they were found to be incompetent, and that was the common word that shot through all of the legal analysis of the ability to make decisions. At some point, about the time I started practicing law, about 40 years ago, we lawyers sort of gave up the word competence and we turned it over to the doctors, and we started talking about capacity instead. So if you look at old sources or you talk to old lawyers like me, you might hear conversations about competence. You more accurately will hear conversations about capacity. The terms are really interchangeable. It's not like competence isn't an important concept anymore, but generally when lawyers talk about competence, they're talking about a diagnosis. When they talk about capacity, they're talking about an effect. So who is competent to sign a will is kind of a medical decision, but who has the capacity to sign a will is typically one that lawyers are making based on the diagnosis and the circumstances that they see. One of the great misunderstandings in the lay public is that somebody who has a diagnosis of dementia is suddenly unable to make any of their own financial, medical, or legal decisions, and that's simply not true. The question of capacity to make decisions for yourself is a functional question. It is invested heavily with diagnosis, but it's not controlled by diagnosis. So somebody who has been diagnosed as having Alzheimer's type dementia might still be able to sign a will and a power of attorney. They might still be able to run a major business. They might still be able to run the United States of America, because we're pretty sure that that has happened in my lifetime, that somebody who had or could have had a diagnosis of dementia was still holding the top job in the US. That doesn't prevent you from functioning if you have the functional capacity. In the law, we focus for preparation of estate planning documents, we focus on testamentary capacity. Are you capable of actually signing a will? And we define it, we lawyers define it in a way that has really nothing to do with diagnosis. We say that your testamentary capacity is composed of 3 elements. Do you know what you have, what your assets are? Now, you don't have to know I have $1,837 over at the Alliance Bank of Arizona. You have to know that you have some bank accounts, that you have some stock. You don't have to know how much. You don't have to know exactly where it is. You don't have to remember where you got it. You just have to have a generalized sense of what your assets are. That's step 1. Step 2 is you have to know who are the language of the law is wonderful. Who are the natural objects of your bounty? That means, do you know who your kids are, if you have kids? Do you know who your next of kin is if you don't have kids? Do you know who's important in your life? Are you able to identify some of the people around you? A very low bar to meet. And the third part of the test of testamentary capacity is whether you understand the nature of the donative act. In other words, when you're being asked to sign a will, do you know that it's a will and not a grocery list? If you're able to identify the concept of a will and that it becomes effective upon your death and that it works to transfer your assets, then you meet that third test. Notice nothing about those 3 tests, knowing the nature and extent of your assets, the natural objects of your bounty, and the nature of the donative act. None of those address any diagnosis that you might have. Of course, if you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, it might affect your ability to do those 3-part tests, but it's a very functional test. So even people late in their aging and dying process might be able to execute testamentary instruments. That's the capacity for executing a will. There are other kinds of capacity in the legal system, so we lawyers tend to focus on the capacity for the ability to do the particular act in question. I may be able to sign a will, but not able to sell my business because I can't understand the nature of the contract that I'm signing. But even though I can't put it together to understand the nature of the contract I'm signing to sell my business, I might still be able to sign a document to buy a new air conditioner for my home. I may have contractual capacity for some purposes, even though I don't have contractual capacity for all purposes. I may have contractual capacity, even though I don't have testamentary capacity, although it's more likely that I would have testamentary capacity and not have contractual capacity. So lawyers are always looking at the functional ability to perform the act in question. Note that to sign a power of attorney, I don't have to have the level of capacity necessary to do all the things I'm giving somebody else the power to do. I just have to understand the nature of a power of attorney and that I'm designating my wife as the person who can make decisions for me. I don't have to be able to make all those decisions myself. That level of capacity is dependent on the function to do the thing you're doing, not the function to do the things that are affected by that decision. One of the key questions in estate planning and capacity is what is the level of capacity required to execute a trust? I might, if I put off all of my estate planning till late in life, I might no longer have the capacity to enter into a contract, but still have the level of capacity needed to sign a will. Can I sign a trust? Well, Arizona says yes, the level of capacity necessary to sign your trust is the same as the level of capacity necessary to sign a will, provided that the trust makes disposition of your assets at death. So the capacity to execute a trust is the same as testamentary capacity for most circumstances. Capacity is kind of the central threshold question for execution of documents and making decisions about your future. But of course, you've heard expressions about undue influence and vulnerable adults. Those are different concepts and they may affect the significance and the validity of instruments that you execute, but they're a little bit different from capacity. So I may have the capacity to sign a will or a power of attorney or execute a trust, but be subject to the extreme undue influence of my next door neighbor who has stepped in and is doing all of my banking for me, and is the one who takes me to the doctor's office, and on whom I've become very dependent. I might be able to articulate what it is that I want and identify the natural objects of my bounty and identify my assets, but still be under the undue influence of this person who is insinuating themselves into my life. Undue influence requires a finding that I have a diminished capacity for some reason. I have a diagnosis of dementia, or I have a physical disability that makes it difficult for me to handle my own affairs. And that I have been subjected to this influence from somebody that has been so undue that they have substituted their will for mine, that what I say is actually what they want. That's a pretty high standard. And notice it's not just influence. If my daughter is providing more of my care than my son does, and she says, "Dad, shouldn't you leave the house to me to reward me for all of the hard work I've done?" Is that undue influence? Not so far. That's just influence. Undue requires her to substitute her will in place of mine and have me parrot what it is that she wants instead of what I want. And so the undue part of undue influence is important. That said, the legal system says if you have been subjected to influence by somebody who is in what we call a confidential relationship, somebody who's doing your bill paying, is with you as a caretaker, is visiting you daily, even if they're a family member, then there may be a presumption of undue influence. And that presumption is critically important, because when somebody later challenges your will or trust or the transactions that were executed under a power of attorney, they have the burden of showing that there was undue influence. But if they can show that confidential relationship, they can show that your daughter took over all of your bill paying and that she moved into the house with you and was your caretaker, and she benefited from the transactions. Two parts. She has to have been in a confidential relationship, and she has to have benefited from the transaction. If those things are true, then the presumption shifts. And now we presume that there was undue influence, and she has to overcome the undue influence presumption in order to uphold the transactions. And that, frankly, is the most common way these things get challenged after the fact, is by an undue influence argument. There is also a line of law, of statutes and cases about vulnerable adults, and it's actually a completely separate thing. It is illegal to take advantage, to exploit a vulnerable adult. And what's a vulnerable adult? Well, a vulnerable adult is somebody who's over the age of 18, who has some sort of a physical, a mental, or emotional condition that makes them susceptible to undue influence. So if you're a vulnerable adult, raise your hand, because I think we all are probably vulnerable adults. If you have a hangnail, well, that's a physical condition. Does it make you subject to being exploited? I can probably construct a scenario where it does. If you're a vulnerable adult and somebody exploits you, we can recover anything that they, at least in theory, that they took from you. Of course, the reality is that vulnerable adults are usually exploited by people who have their own problems, and whatever they have managed to get has been spent on gambling or drugs or whatever. So it's very difficult to recover money from people who exploit vulnerable adults. But one of the things that we can do is argue that whatever they were supposed to inherit, they might have to give up because of a finding that they exploited a vulnerable adult. But those three things, testamentary capacity, undue influence, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, they're different. They're kind of interrelated, but they invest the ability of somebody to do planning and make decisions for their future. Of course, that all kind of assumes that you're making these decisions at a time when you're already under some diminished capacity. If you would have made those decisions 10 years or 20 years before, then we'd all be ahead of the game. We wouldn't have to be trying to decide if your diminished capacity was part of the reason why you had left a disproportionate amount to your daughter. Also, by the way, if you have a 20-year-old will or trust that says, I leave everything equally to my 3 children, and then in your dotage, you change that and leave everything to the daughter, that raises the suspicion of undue influence that, that I described. And so those late life decisions sometimes cause additional problems. It would be great if everybody would take care of all this very early in their aging process. Wills, trusts, powers of attorney, all very important. By the way, which of those is the most important? Your will, your trust, your financial power of attorney, your healthcare power of attorney? Think about that a minute. Everybody should have a will. Many, many people should have trusts. Everybody needs to do a healthcare power of attorney, but the single most important document in that list, I think, is the durable financial power of attorney. If you just had enough ink left in your pen to sign one document, that's the one that I would tell you to sign. The legislature has already written a will for you. They've decided you want to leave everything to your spouse, if you have a spouse, and if not, to your children. If you don't have children, then you want to leave everything to your brothers and sisters. If you don't have brothers and sisters, then you want to leave everything to your cousins. And there are some exceptions to that basic structure. For instance, if you have a spouse and children who are not children of that spouse, then the legislature has tinkered with what it is you want. But for most people I talk to, they actually want about what the legislature guessed that they wanted. So having a will may not be the most important thing. Having a trust just avoids probate, and that would be nice. By the way, big common misunderstanding, having a will does not avoid probate. If you write it down in a will, you haven't avoided the probate process. You've just given instructions to the probate judge. Having a trust avoids probate, but it's far from the most critical thing that you need to do. Healthcare power of attorney, terribly important. Everybody should express their wishes in advance, but if you don't, our legislature has decided that your next of kin can make healthcare decisions for you. The only one they can't make is they can't disconnect you from feeding tubes or any other artificial treatment that is sustaining life without any prospect of recovery. Other than that, family members can make decisions for you. And the first person on that list is your spouse, and then your children, and they'll find somebody on the list who can make decisions. So while a healthcare power of attorney is terrifically important, it's not the most important. Financial power of attorney, who's going to sign your income taxes, who's going to make decisions about withdrawals from your IRA or 401k, who's going to pay your bills, all of that. Your next of kin doesn't have the automatic right to do it the way they have the automatic ability to do healthcare decisions. The legislature has not written a financial power of attorney for you. So I think that's the most important of that set of documents. There are other things that we can talk about in planning for people as they face the end of life and their advancing dementia. I like to put them under the heading of I'll be the first to know, because that's what my clients usually say to me. I say, what is your plan for driving as you find that you're unable to drive anymore? Who's going to step in and tell you to stop driving? Who's going to make arrangements for your alternate transportation? My clients forever say, I don't think I need to address that. I'll be the first to know when I can't drive. That has not been my experience. I don't know about the rest of you, but I find that my clients are among the last to know that they should stop driving. They're among the last to know that they should turn over management of their affairs to their children or whoever is going to take over. They're among the last to know that they are no longer able to handle the flood of mail and email that begs them for donations and for worthy causes. One of the things in the planning part, when I talk to clients, that I like to emphasize is this difference between two different kinds of durable financial powers of attorney. These documents get a bunch of adjectives stuck in front of them. It's not just a power of attorney, it's a durable power of attorney. What makes it durable? It has some language in it that says either if I become incapacitated, this power of attorney will spring into existence, or this power of attorney exists today, and if I become incapacitated, it will continue to exist. And that's the difference in the first case between what we usually call a springing power of attorney. It springs into existence on your incapacity. And a surviving power of attorney, it continues even if you become incapacitated. The financial adjective just means that these things are for things other than health decisions, for financial decisions, managing your bank account and your brokerage account and your 401k and paying and signing your tax returns and the like. The difficulty is with my clients, and I'm sure with the people that you all deal with, including family members, is if you say, do you want your power of attorney to be effective right now, or only if you become incapacitated? The natural inclination for people is to say, well, I don't want to give anybody the power to make decisions for me now. I only want it to be effective if I become incapacitated. My response to that usually is gently, so let me understand, you don't trust your daughter to make decisions for you now, but you would trust her if you were too incapacitated to watch over what she's doing, right? Because if you don't trust her right now, I think maybe she's not the right person to name as agent in your power of attorney. And then they usually say, oh, no, I wasn't saying that. I trust her completely. Well, then give her the power right now, because here is the practical reality that you have to deal with. If you have a power of attorney that says, this only becomes effective if 2 doctors sign affidavits saying that I'm unable to manage my affairs. Has anybody tried to get a letter from a doctor in the last 10 years? Good luck with getting any doctor to sign any letter that says anything about your capacity. And having 2 doctors have to sign something, good luck with that. And try to take that power of attorney down to Wells Fargo Bank and say, you know, I just can't get the doctor's letter, but you all know my mom. You know that she's incapacitated, that she gave me the power of attorney. Let me do things. Good luck with that. The bank is not going to let you use that power of attorney. So I try to get clients to understand that making their power of attorney springing is not any favor to their family. It's going to be very difficult to administer, and it's not really protecting against anything that they believe they have to worry about. Nonetheless, clients are very anxious about giving immediately effective powers of attorney, and so they lean toward having surviving powers of attorney instead. I'm sorry, they lean toward springing rather than surviving. The sort of related thing is when clients have created a trust, I try very hard to get them to think about naming a co-trustee who can act right now, so that as you lose your capacity, as your capacity continues to diminish, somebody can take over more and more of the function. And once again, it's a hard sell sometimes, but it's a useful approach to making that transition more effective, more seamless, and less complicated for the people who begin to take over. Of course, in addition to the questions about driving and whether your powers of attorney and your trust ought to be immediate or only upon proof of incapacity, there are all sorts of other things that come up, and you all have seen them, and you've seen them professionally and as well probably as in family members. There is an increasing susceptibility to exploitation by strangers, and for that matter by family and friends. It was an interesting article that I read the other day about how the pandemic lockdown has dramatically increased the amount of exploitation that has come in over the transom by mail and email. And it's important to have mechanisms in place for somebody to be able to address those problems, even as your capacity is diminishing, not completely diminished. I wanted to talk a little bit about philanthropy, particularly in the context of planning and dealing with your estate or the estates of family members or people that you deal with. And philanthropy is a great goal. Everybody ought to be thinking about whether they could leave a legacy, as the phrase often goes, whether they can benefit others and the community that they live in during their lives and after their deaths. And there are some really efficient ways to exercise those philanthropic tendencies. Efficient meaning that they work well and that they actually make tax sense. Most of the efficiency issues come up in the context of tax and what kinds of things make good sense to leave to charitable organizations and how you might do that. So here's a key rule, a key question. What's the smartest thing you could give to charity? assuming that you want to make a charitable gift of some kind, what is the smartest thing that you could give to charity? Well, the answer is your retirement account. Why does that make sense? Because if you leave your retirement account to family members and they begin to cash it out after you've died, we can talk endlessly about the rules for them cashing it out, but one key rule is as they cash it out, they're going to pay income taxes on it. If you intended to leave, let's say, a significant amount of money, just to make this illustration make sense, I'm going to have you leave $100,000 to charity, and you have $1 million, and coincidentally, you have a $100,000 IRA that you're as part of your estate. You have $1 million, of which 100,000 is IRA, and you want to leave 100,000 to charity. Well, if you left $100,000 of your other estate to the charity, they'd get the $100,000. Then $900,000 that you leave to other family members or whomever, they'll get it, but they'll pay taxes on the IRA as they take it out. So you've given them something less than $900,000. If you leave that $100,000 IRA to the charity and leave everything else to your family, the charity gets their $100,000. They have to pay tax on it when they close it out. And what's their tax rate? 0. Charities don't pay tax. So you just gave them $100,000 without any diminution, and you left the other $900,000 to the family members without any tax at all. And that's such a common misunderstanding. People think if you inherit money, you must pay a tax on it. No, there is no income tax on inheritances. And there's only an estate tax if you leave them more than, under current rules, $11 million, or if you're married, $22 million. And those numbers may go down, but they're not going to go down to $100,000. So there's really no tax decision in trying to decide how much to give to family and charities and which things to give to them, except the income tax on your retirement account. You also can make some tax-wise decisions about present gifts. If you wanted to give something right now to charity and not wait until you die, there are a couple of ways to do it. And once again, your retirement account is a particularly attractive way to do that. Because here's the problem. You have that $100,000 IRA. This year you have to take, because you're pretty old, you have to take out $10,000. If you take out the $10,000, you pay income tax on $10,000, but you turn right around because you have good charitable inclinations. You want to give $10,000 to your favorite charity. You can hand them the $10,000 and get a deduction on your income tax return, but you don't get a deduction for the whole $10,000. There are some thresholds that you have to cross. So you will pay some income tax on that distribution, even though you pass it right through to the charity. Well, here's good news. You can use, so long as it's using your required minimum distribution, you have to take out that $10,000. You can just direct it directly to the charity, never touch it yourself. It never shows up as income for you. It does show up as income for them, but once again, they pay no income tax. So they get the full use of the $10,000. You pay not a dime of income tax on that transaction. So if you are of an age where you have to take minimum distributions, none of us have to take minimum distributions for the rest of this year of 2020, but beginning next year, people who are 72 and older will, and people who turned 70 before the pandemic started, will have to make withdrawals. And if you are in that situation and you are giving money to charity, even if all you're doing is giving $1,000 a year to the local NPR radio station, do it out of your required minimum distribution and save a couple of bucks in taxes doing it, and it helps set up the discipline. More elaborate things are available as well, both during your life and at death. You could set up a donor advised fund. You could use charitable remainder trust. A charitable remainder trust is kind of a fun thing to describe. So I'm going to use another story. You bought a piece of real estate out in the Tucson mountains 30 years ago. You paid $10,000 for it, and it's been doing great. There's nothing built on it. You don't ever want anything built on it. But you know what? The market has been going up. That $10,000 piece of real estate is now worth $250,000. You don't really want that land anymore. And wouldn't it be great to just sell it and put the $250,000 in your pocket? Well, if you do, you will pay capital gains tax on $240,000 of that sale. And it will be a significant tax. It won't be crippling. You'll have more money than you did before, but it'll be a significant tax. You know what you can do? You can create a charitable remainder trust. You can transfer that $250,000 parcel of land to the charitable remainder trust. You can arrange it so that you get a stream of income for the rest of your life from the sales proceeds from the land. And you get a present income tax deduction. And when you die, whatever's left in that charitable remainder trust goes to charity. Now you can even, in theory, be trustee of your charitable remainder trust and reserve the ability to change what charity receives the money at your death. But you could also talk to somebody like the Community Foundation of Southern Arizona, who will be happy to administer that trust, or the donor advised fund that is very similar, has much as a very similar effect, but doesn't provide you a lifetime income. Either kind of arrangement would be a way for you to make a significant lifetime charitable gift without incurring the income tax that you would have to pay if you sold that appreciated piece of property. And this works, by the way, as well for houses or investment real estate or stocks and bonds that have gone up significantly in value. So there are lots of ways that you can make transfers that affect your current tax situation, and also leave a legacy that will help you give back to the community. If you have any interest in any of those ideas, I think Tamara would be happy to point you to the people at CFSA who could talk to you about it. One last thing I want to say about charity before we get back to a quick checkup on planning is that if you are planning on leaving a share of your estate to charity, please think about, or you know someone who is, please think about the way to do that. It's very common for people in my office to say, well, I want to leave 10% to charity. And I say, okay, great. 10% of what? 10% of everything you own, including your IRA? No, the IRA is going to go to my nephew who really needs the stream of income. Well, I told you why the IRA is actually a better thing to leave to charity, but okay, you don't want to do that. 10% of the rest, well, I guess we better make it 12%. Okay, so what we want to do is require people who are administering your estate to get an appraisal so that we know that the charity gets its 12% and didn't get stuck with only 10.5% because of faulty valuations of things. And we have to account to the charity until the trust. Could we change that to $100,000 or some dollar amount, rather than a percentage of your estate? Just as in a general way, it is a much more attractive administration. Now, of course, the difficulty is what happens if you say, I want to leave $100,000 to charity, and when you die, you only have $150,000 because you've spent it all, which, by the way, we encourage. We hope that you do that. But if you die with less than you intended to, maybe that overpays the charity. Well, that's not a problem. We can say, I leave $100,000 or 10% of my estate, whichever is more or whichever is less. We can do it either direction to the charity. And assuming that you die with about what you have now, you can have a dollar amount that goes to the charity rather than having to make that calculation. It's an easier choice for the lawyers to administer, and it probably saves some money for your estate in the long term. Don't let any of that discourage you. Go ahead and leave a significant amount to charity. Go ahead and leave a legacy. It's a good idea. Quick checkup for you, for your clients and professional contacts, for your family, to think through, have you done these things? Do you have a will? Do you have a healthcare power of attorney and a financial power of attorney? Do you have a trust? Do you need a trust? Can I, in 2 minutes, tell you whether or not you need a trust? Actually, I can make a pretty good stab at it. The whole reason most people create a trust is to avoid probate. Probate is not as evil and awful and expensive and time-consuming as people think, which is not a way of saying it's a lot of fun and everybody ought to be sure to do a probate. But it's not as bad as most people think it is. So having a trust for most people becomes a cost-benefit analysis. You'll pay more at the inception to create the trust because the lawyer who's helping you build the trust has to do a lot of the things that would happen in an ordinary probate after your death, so it's more expensive to do. But on balance, in almost every case, there will be a savings having created a trust. Your estate will pay enough less in legal and administrative costs to save more than the cost of doing the trust. The difficulty is that the savings might not be huge, and you have to write the check out of your pocket to save your heirs and devotees money after your death. And some people say, yeah, this is all found money to them, they'll be fine. They can pay it then. I don't care if they have to pay more. That's the cost benefit analysis. There's one big exception to that, whether you need a trust or not question, and that is if you have beneficiaries who are on public benefits or spendthrifts, unable to manage money, yeah, you need a trust. And we can talk about the precise nature of trust that you need. In addition to having those documents in place, do you know where they are? Do you know when they were last updated? Can't tell you how many times I've had clients come in and say, yeah, I last saw you, I think it was about 5 years ago. I can't find the documents. You must have them. I say, no, we handed them to you. Here's the note saying we handed them to you 13 years ago, not 5 years ago. Happens again and again and again. How often do you have to update your documents? Rule of thumb that I give is 5 years. Your estate planning documents have themselves a life expectancy of about 5 years. And then I very quickly say to people, and I know you're not going to come to me in 5 years. You're going to wait 10 before you come back. And that's the real life expectancy of your estate planning documents. I just told you 5 to try to get you to be thinking about it and get back to me before we hit 10. Not only do you know where your documents are, do the people who are named in those documents know where they are? And do they know where your bank accounts and your brokerage accounts and your life insurance papers and where all those things are? And could you please put them all together in one place so that people can sort out your affairs? And this is critically important today with so much being done online. I've had a lot of clients who have only electronic banks that they don't even know where the bank is. Is it in North Dakota? Is it in China? Who knows? They had the best rate and the best arrangement for online bill paying, and so that's where the money is. And I don't even get paper statements in the mail. Used to be that I would tell people, if you don't know where your father's assets are, just put a forwarding order on the mail and you'll find out in about a month. But that's no longer necessarily true. If you have a Bitcoin account, it is, by design, it is kind of secret. So you need to make sure somebody knows where to look, or that money will just evaporate at your death. When we do estate planning with people, we give them a little workbook that they can start filling out with information about where to find stuff. And if you don't have something like that, then you can do it yourself, but it's a project that needs to get done. The last thing I want to say about this, and then I'll handle any questions. You guys have been very quiet and haven't asked a lot of questions, so maybe I've either bored the heck out of you or answered every question, or you went out for a cup of coffee. But so here are some last things to think about related to planning for your final disposition of your estate and your personal property. Do you know where a bunch of other documents are, like the deed to your house? Oh, hey, I got good news for you. If you live in Arizona, you don't need the deed to your house. If somebody writes to you and says, for a mere $37.50, we'll get you a deed to your house, you should have one. Baloney. You don't need a copy of the deed to your house because it's in the public records, and that's where we're going to care. Vehicle titles, we can get duplicates, but it'd be really nice if your vehicle titles were in one place. Insurance contracts, we can figure it out probably, but the insurance company that you bought life insurance from in 1985 has changed its name 3 times since then, and it's going to be a challenge to figure out what the current name is, and that account number that you wrote down in the check register when you paid off the last payment on your life insurance policy in 1992. That account number is no longer the account number, and that recipient is no longer the company. So help us out, collect all of this information. Does that mean you need a safe deposit box? Almost certainly not. There is almost nobody who needs a safe deposit box. If you have a collection of diamonds and gold coins, great, get a safe deposit box and put them in there. If you have a collection of old pocket watches and miscellaneous documents, please put those somewhere in your study and a note in the top left desk drawer, because that's the first place we're going to look for stuff, is in the top left desk drawer of your study. So tell us there where it is, but they don't have intrinsic value. Well, the pocket watch might, but the rest doesn't have enough intrinsic value to put in a safe deposit box. I actually had the circumstance where I had to close up an estate for a guy who had lived in nowhere, Wisconsin most of his life. When he moved to Arizona, he kept his safe deposit box. I ultimately couldn't get them to open the box remotely. I had to buy an airplane ticket and spend 3 days going to Wisconsin and driving to the middle of nowhere. It was about a 3-hour drive from the airport, the nearest major airport, to get to this place. Got there just as the bank was about to close, because of course everything works differently than you plan it. Went in, opened the box, and found, guess what? A broken pocket watch and his Masonic ring in the safe deposit box. Don't do that. Just close your safe deposit box instead. Do some planning about driving. That's a big, big issue. It's not enough to just say, I give my wife the power to make the decision when I should stop driving. You need to also think about how you're going to get around. You need to move to a place that is more efficient to get to the doctors and the grocery store and all the places you need to go. Is that one of the ways to address it? I will say that Uber and Lyft have dramatically improved the flexibility of seniors today. Unfortunately, they're the people least likely to figure out how to use rideshare arrangements, but what a great opportunity to have your account all set up and maybe even some cash in the account for that emergency when you really shouldn't be driving. Long-term care costs, a huge issue that is beyond what we want to do today. But in a general way, you need to think about how you're going to pay for nursing home care at the end of your life if you require it. Rule of thumb number that I tell clients is today in Pima County, Arizona, assume between $7,000 and $8,000 per month for nursing home costs. Oh, you're not going to the nursing home? Oh, you're going to stay at home? Great, make that $15,000 per month. It is vastly more expensive to provide nursing home care level care in your home. Yeah, we'd all like to stay home, but the best way to prepare for the cost of long-term care is to be fabulously wealthy. Short of that, long-term care insurance may be appropriate for you. Planning for eligibility for Medicaid may be important, but you need to address those questions. Organ donation, I always ask clients, are you an organ donor? They almost always say to me, because my clients tend to be in their 60s or older, they almost say, I'm old, nobody wants my organs. Not true, actually. The organ donor people say they want everybody's corneas and skin, almost everybody's. So if you want to be an organ donor, the most important thing is not to tell your lawyer or even to tell your kids. It's to get that little heart-shaped thing on your driver's license. If you've got that, you're an organ donor. You also want to tell your kids and tell your lawyer so that it's clear what you intended, that it wasn't accidental that you checked that box on the driver's license, but the driver's license is the key for your organ donor preferences. And funeral arrangements. Do you have strong feelings about how you want to be buried? You want to be cremated and your ashes scattered from Windy Point on the Mount Lemmon Highway? That's illegal, by the way, but nobody's going to stop your family from doing it. Why is it illegal? You can't scatter ashes. You can't dispose of human bodies, body remains on public land. So if you can find a private section of land on Mount Lemmon, it's actually legal to do it, but in theory, not from Windy Point. I have stood there in the cremains dust a time or two myself, I have to admit, violating the law. That's not most people's favorite. The Saguaro National Park is. Be that as it may, make sure people know what you want. The best way to make sure that they know what you want is to make the arrangements and pay for them. It's astonishing how much easier it is to accomplish anything with the funeral homes if the arrangement has been prepaid. So it's not enough. It's good to have made the arrangements and signed an agreement, told the funeral home exactly what you want, but it's not enough, particularly if there is dissent in your family. And that really is maybe my last point. If there is dissent in your family, or there might be dissent in your family, a key element of all of the planning that you do is to tell them what you're doing. Can't tell you how many times I have had family members say, yeah, my sister is trying to cremate my mother's body. She has a document that mom signed. I know she wasn't competent when she signed that. I know she would never want to be cremated. Of course, baloney. But that sibling was empowered to say that because mom never sat that sibling down, the dissenting sibling down, and said, I have given your sister the power to make the decision and I want to be cremated. Had that happened, a lot of mischief and legal expense could have been avoided. So have a conversation about all of these things. We're coming up on my favorite day for it. I'm a big proponent of setting aside that time between the end of the football game and the turkey coming out of the oven, because nobody can ever correctly calculate the time that the turkey is going to be ready. So take that hour and make that the time to talk about all of this with your family and clear the air, and then you'll have something to be thankful for. That's all I have to tell you. You all have been quiet and lovely, but maybe you have questions.
Does anyone have specific questions? Feel free to type it in the chat box or to unmute yourself and ask those questions directly to Robert.
I can see Tim's fingers working.
Well, while he's typing, I did have someone actually email me and say that they couldn't attend this training, but they were very interested if you had specific advice for LGBTQ seniors in the community and any special considerations that they should make.
What a great question. And you know, I've really stopped leaning on that, because the basic message I used to give all the time was there is no equivalent to marriage, excuse me, for gay and lesbian couples. And so you have to duplicate the privileges of marriage, and that's not true anymore. There is marriage for gay and lesbian couples. So the notion that your next of kin has power to make decisions for you applies to married same-sex couples the same way it does to married opposite-sex couples. Hang on. But there is still a good piece of advice in there. One moment. And that is that you will help save family disharmony if you explain what you're doing and actually prepare documents. Don't just rely on the marital relationship. Or if you haven't married your same-sex partner, obviously you can't rely on the marital relationship. You need to have the documents. They need to be explicit. They need to not only say who does get to make decisions and who does get to receive the personal property, but who doesn't get to make decisions or receive the personal property. So yes, it's more important for gay and lesbian couples to execute documents, but the good news is that if they don't get around to it, the law has caught up with them and is more likely to be beneficial.
We have a question also from Pat. If capacity for one purpose but not others, and
I think I see the point of the question. Okay. The question is, suppose the capacity is questionable. Maybe it's pretty clear that they didn't have capacity to manage their business, but they do, we think, have capacity to sign a will. How do we tell that after the fact? Really excellent question, because the challenge to capacity is not likely to happen at the point of the execution of the documents. It's going to happen 6 months or a year later when the person has clearly lost capacity or has even died. There are legions of cases in the reported cases that deal with this question and trying to show what mom's capacity was when she signed this document 18 months ago. And that relies pretty often on medical testimony. What was the date of her diagnosis? What does the doctor say about the time that the doctor saw her 2 weeks before or 3 weeks after the document was signed? But a key thing that is really helpful is to have lawyers prepare the documents, because the lawyers will be there, or their staffs will be there at the time of execution, and they'll have notes about what they did in order to satisfy themselves that mom had capacity. So that's a really good argument. If there's a likely challenge, it's a really good argument for involving lawyers rather than trying to do it yourself.
And then bye Tim, thanks for joining us. And then there's a question from Beverly as well about the financial amount that should be considered when making a trust. At what amount is a trust worth creating?
Yeah, and because it's really, for most people, a cost-benefit analysis, you might turn the question around and say, at what level is it not worth the trouble? And there's not a good hard and fast number, because it depends on your circumstances. Do you have 7 children or 1? Do you have family disharmony already baked in? Do you have that 1 of 7 children who has a disability, and 1 who is married badly, and 1 who has a drinking problem? Even a relatively small estate might be a good case for a trust. But I can say that my rule of thumb is, if you have an estate of less than $100,000, it's pretty likely that it's not going to be cost effective to create a trust. However, that includes the value of your house. Again and again, I see clients who say, I want to make sure the house stays in the family forever, and my great-grandchildren will have some place to live while they go to the University of Arizona. Man, what a challenge to make that happen, if that's the only asset or the only significant asset you have.
She had a follow-up question as well, saying, should the name of the children be added to real estate titles?
And this is a very fraught question. There are 2, in a general way, in Arizona, and the law may be different in another state if you have real estate in another state. In Arizona, there are 2 ways to quote, add your children's names to the title. One is to make them joint owners. But understand, if you do that, you are giving them a present interest. So if you have 3 children and you decide to put their names on the title, and you transfer your house to the 4 of you and the 3 kids, you now own 1/4 of your house. And if the kids want to get together and force you out because they think it's time for you to go to the nursing home, guess what? They have 3/4 of the votes in order to do that. So I discourage people from actually transferring ownership of the house. But Arizona does give another option, which is called the Beneficiary Deed, by which you can say, I give this property to my 3 children, but only effective on my death. And that Beneficiary Deed is revocable. So you could one day say, oh, I forgot my grandson who I want to treat like a child, so let's change that and make it 4 beneficiaries. Or my daughter has offended me and I want to take her off the list. You can do that. You can also sell the house without having to get consent from them. You can revoke the beneficiary deed altogether if you want to. So that's often a better choice. This is, however, pretty fact sensitive. If you are headed to the nursing home, I'm going to give you a different answer than if you are, 55 years old living at home and have only 1 child. It's going to be dependent on your circumstances.
Pat had another question as well, saying, if you have a niece or nephew with terrible judgment, including financial judgment, is there an alternative to a trust when no one is ideal to manage that, an annuity or other options?
Yeah, that's a real problem. If you're trying to tie up the bequest in a way that doesn't hurt them by giving them too much money, and you don't have anybody to act as trustee, then that's a real challenge. An annuity doesn't help really, because they can liquidate the annuity and just get pennies on the dollar for the value of it and then spend that badly. So they not only aren't protected from bad decisions, but they also get less of an inheritance to make bad decisions with. Better answer is probably to try to figure out who could be trustee. Banks are not interested in a trust that's worth less than a couple $1 million in the modern environment. There are non-bank private fiduciaries, law firms like our law firm, social workers who act as fiduciary, can act as trustee. So there are some choices. Chat with your lawyer about what those choices are, but it is a challenge when there's no family to act in that role.
Well, that was all the questions we have. Did anyone have any final questions that they wanted to put to Robert? All right, if not, I think we're all done for today. Thank you again so much, Robert, for taking your time this morning and spending it with us. And thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.